Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose for ourselves. So listen in to find out if my life was changed by productivity guru Oliver Burkeman and his book 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It. Whether I've come to terms with my ambivalent feelings about Colm Tóibín's book about author Thomas Mann, The Magician, and how I'm getting on with Motherhood by Sheila Heti, in which she struggles with her own ambivalent feelings on whether or not to have a child.
And on my list, No Touching by Ketty Rouf, a French prize winner about a woman who teaches philosophy by day, then moonlights as a striptease dancer by night. Also on my list, The Mothers, the debut novel from Brit Bennett, best-selling author of The Vanishing Half.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them.
That's coming up here on the Book Club Review. Kate, on our recent episode dedicated to motherhood and in honor of Mother's Day, I was saying, I think, how I never read any books about mothers, and then how funny, 2 weeks later, without doing this consciously, I should say, I picked up Brit Bennett's The Mothers, which I'd been wanting to read some time since I loved her writing so much on The Vanishing Half.
And? Any good?
Oh, we're going to...
Oh, were you not ready?
Not ready for that.
It's true, that's not in our order, is it? It wasn't what we planned.
No, it's totally a fair question. We'll pause my answer. What I'll say is that I saw it at the Vancouver Public Library, just facing out at the end of one of the stacks, and I'd been wanting to read it for some time. So it was more serendipity, I think, than my subconscious inviting me to read more books about motherhood. But I had a great haul. You know, sometimes you go to the library and you just find all the books you want to read, even if you didn't know you wanted to read them. So I was there last Thursday. I've already read The Mothers by Brit Bennett. I've read that in the last 48 hours. And before that, I dove straight into No Touching by Ketty Rouf, and I'll be telling all of you guys about that. But I should also say I picked up a really interesting book called Savage Tongues by Azarine van der Vliet Ulumi. That's quite the name.
How are you spelling that? We'll put that one in the show notes.
She has a book here called Savage Tongues, winner of the PEN Faulkner Award. And it sounds so great. Just a teaser. It's summer when Azaru, an Iranian-American teenager, goes to Spain to meet her estranged father at an apartment he owns there. He never shows up, instead sending his step-nephew, Omar, a 40-year-old Lebanese man, to deliver her a weekly allowance. As the weeks progress, Azaru is drawn into a mercurial, charged, and ultimately catastrophic affair with Omar, a relationship that shatters her at the cusp of adulthood. And then the story is really told 2 decades later. Lots of powerful reviews on the back, so I'm going to read that next. And then I also got Little by Edward Carey, which is about Madame Tussauds. And this was on my radar when it was published. Did you read it?
Well, I've wanted to read that since it was recommended on the pod, Laura, by Simon Thomas. Do you remember when I talked to him all that time ago?
I certainly remember the book name, so that must be somewhere buried deep in my memory.
Yeah, he flagged that up at the time, and I thought it sounded good then, and I still think it sounds good now, but I have not got around to it. So I'm going to be excited to hear what you think of it. I was just looking up the PEN Faulkner Award because I thought, oh yes, that sounds terribly prestigious, and then realised that I didn't actually know what it was. PEN Faulkner Foundation celebrates literature by giving out 3 major literary awards. Our goal in doing so is to honour major literary achievements and help readers discover the breadth and diversity of contemporary fiction. Anyway, so a good one. Do you want to know about time and how to use it, Laura? You're a very no-nonsense, productive... You don't mess around. You don't waste time. Whenever we have any grand scheme, you're like, right, let's sit down. Let's come up with a 5-point plan. How are we going to execute this? You know. So I don't know how you'd get on with Oliver Burkeman. I do know when I finished reading this book, you were the first person I wanted to run it by.
Well, you've been telling me, or at least I've seen it bubbling up on Instagram, that this book has been making you question the meaning of your life in a slightly fraught way. So I'm not a big fan of the book already, I have to say. I don't like that it's put you out of whack.
Well,
but tell me more.
I've been on quite an interesting journey with it because when I read it, I felt completely engaged with it. I really enjoyed it. I was fizzing with ideas and I loved that, and it set my thoughts racing off in a totally new way, and I thought, oh, that was brilliant, and I was really energized and inspired by it. And then, you know, what happens is, or what happens with me anyway, is that generally not that long after I've read a book, I start to forget all the little details, and particularly with this, because there's a lot in this. And then I was thinking about, well, what am I left with? And I think that's when my feelings about it slightly change, but I will come on to that. So let me tell you. Oliver Burkeman previously wrote a book called The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. And I was certainly familiar with him from a column that he wrote for many years for The Guardian, which was called This Column Will Change Your Life. I remember that column. I always used to turn to it with enthusiasm and then finish feeling a bit disappointed because I didn't really feel like he ever had come up with anything that was going to change my life. But it turns out that's because that column was all about productivity and strategies and how to, you know, dominate your inbox and get things done. And actually, after all these years spent thinking about life optimization, I guess, has come around to this idea that actually, you know what? The thing you have to do is give up on that idea about getting things done. We have to think about the time we have in this life. The average lifespan, call it 80, you get 4,000 weeks. And even just putting it like that, 4,000 weeks, suddenly you're like, that doesn't sound like much. Doesn't sound like enough. So if you live to 80, you'll have barely more than 4,000 weeks on Earth. How will you decide how to spend them? It says, rejecting the futile modern obsession with getting everything done, 4,000 weeks introduces readers to tools for constructing a meaningful life by embracing rather than denying their limitations. Drawing on the insights of both ancient and contemporary philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual teachers, Oliver Burkeman sets out to realign our relationship with time, and in doing so, liberate us from its tyranny. So it's this idea about accepting finitude. You only have so much time, and that time is limited. With the best will in the world, even if you were the most productive person on earth, you will never, ever do even the tiniest fraction of all of the things that you want to do in your life with your time. You just won't. No one will. No one can. It's completely impossible. And so if you then let go of that idea, it really resonated with me, the idea that a lot of us carry around that, you know, if we can just get this thing done, if we can just get this big thing in our life out of the way, you know, I have that at the minute, we're in the process of moving house. So I have this real sense, we'll just move to the new house and then I'll be able to relax and then I'll be able to kind of sit back and have a nice time. And it's this and then. And one of his major points is you don't know the and then is ever going to come. You can't rely on it. You can't be sure of that. The moment to sit back and enjoy yourself is now, like the moment you're in, because you don't know if you're going to get that eventual thing that you've got in the back of your mind, that you just have to get everything else done and then you can finally get to this point where you can sit back and be happy. As with so much of this self-helpy stuff, a lot of it just feels like the most obvious common sense. Like, of course that's the case. But I, for one, hadn't really thought of it that way before. And I found that really interesting. I was like, oh, yes, the moment is now. What am I doing with my moments?
And does he give you guidance on what you should be doing with your moment?
And then this is where I think it's quite good, because he does, actually. He gives you a lot of interesting and entertaining and encouraging and challenging ideas about how to think about your relationship with time and how you use time and the decisions that you make. And I mean, there's so much in it. It was one of those books where when I was reading it, I kept reading bits out to people. I kept talking about it with people. If I bumped into someone, taxi driver I was chatting to, I was like, so 4,000 weeks, you know, not that long. But so for book club, I love it because it was just such a fun conversation starter in a way. What I really appreciated is that he is someone who spent a long time thinking about the subject. And so when he wants to illustrate an example, or he pulls in a quote, or he looks back to a philosopher, I found all that beautifully done. I was always so pleased by the quotations and the way that he looked back into the past. There's one really interesting bit I was going to flag up, because one of the issues that I think a lot of us feel plagued with is distraction. If we are what we pay attention to, then how dispiriting is it if all the time we're distracted by things on the internet that we can't get away from? And he's got a really good chapter on that. I mean, I have underlined so many passages in this book. I should really make my own version of this book where I just pull out all the bits that I underlined, because they were obviously the things that I felt I needed, you know? So he starts this chapter with this story about this watermelon, the watermelon problem, online in 2016. As the year's polarizing American presidential race intensified, and more than 30 armed conflicts raged around the globe, approximately 3 million people spent part of their day watching two reporters from BuzzFeed wrap rubber bands around a watermelon. Gradually, over the course of 43 agonising minutes, the pressure ramped up, both the psychological kind and the physical pressure on the watermelon, until at minute 44, the 686th rubber band was applied. What happened next won't amaze you. The watermelon exploded messily. The reporters high-fived, wiped the splatters from their reflective goggles, and then ate some watermelon. The broadcast ended. The Earth continued its orbit round the sun. I'm not raising this to imply there's anything especially shameful about spending 44 minutes of your day staring at a watermelon on the internet. On the contrary, given what was to happen to life online in the years after 2016, as the trolls and neo-Nazis began to crowd out the pop quizzes and cat videos, and social media increasingly became a matter of doom scrolling in a depressive daze through bottomless feeds of bad news, the BuzzFeed watermelon escapade already feels like a tale from a happier time. But it's worth mentioning, because it illustrates an elephant in the room problem with everything I've been arguing so far about time and time management. That problem is distraction. After all, it hardly matters how committed you are to making the best use of your limited time if day after day your attention gets wrenched away by things on which you never wanted to focus. It's a safe bet that none of those 3 million people woke up that morning with the intention of using a portion of their lives to watch a watermelon burst. Nor, when the moment arrived, did they necessarily feel as though they were freely choosing to do so. "I want to stop watching so bad, but I'm already committed," read one typically rueful comment on Facebook. "I've been watching you guys put rubber bands around a watermelon for 40 minutes, wrote someone else. "What am I doing with my life?" The watermelon tale is a reminder, moreover, that these days distraction has become all but synonymous with digital distraction. It's what happens when the internet gets in the way of our attempts to concentrate. But this, I think, is a lovely example of the way he pulls things back. This is misleading. Philosophers have been worrying about distraction at least since the time of the ancient Greeks, who saw it less as a matter of external interruptions and more as a question of character, a systematic inner failure to use one's time on what one claimed to value the most. Their reason for treating distraction so seriously was straightforward, and it's the reason we ought to do so too. What you pay attention to will define, for you, what reality is. The thing I found so delicious about it is that blend of the contemporary pop cultural soup that we all swim round in, and then bringing in these philosophers, and then, of course, his own anecdotes about his attempts to control his own inbox and experiments that he's conducted on himself and things that he's learned in the course of writing that column. And obviously, usually he fails, and so that's always really interesting. And yeah, so, I mean, as a read, I loved it. I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. I would recommend it to anyone. Read it and then go and have a conversation with someone about it. That will be a lot of fun. In terms of it changing your life, ultimately, for me, I think what I realised is that he shows you a different way of thinking about time. And you feel really electrified by this idea of seeing things in a different way. But the trouble is, when you finished reading the book, gradually all that slips away, and I personally found my habitual way of thinking about the world and my place in it is so entrenched that ultimately nothing really changed for me, except, thanks to Oliver Burkeman, now I have this keen sense of the fact that I'm not really looking at things in the right way. And if anything, that's just made me more depressed. You know, it's like, I feel like I've been shown something, but now I've been left in a place where I just can't really do anything about it. And that just makes me feel pathetic, you know. But also just sort of, you know. But as you can tell, even just talking about it again, all my affection for it has come flooding back. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Have I ever forced you to read Happiness by Design by Paul Dolan?
Yes, you have.
The reason I love that, listeners, is his focus on the fact that we are all on a spectrum in terms of what makes us happy. And that spectrum would vacillate between pleasure and purpose. And some people are more purpose-driven and some people are more pleasure-driven. And what would be a waste of time to a purpose-driven person is in no way a waste of time to a pleasure-driven person. And of course, we need different things at different moments in our day, in our week, in our year. So I don't know. Yes, I am quite a productive-driven person, and I bring a lot of that to work. And then even last night, I read for 2 hours straight. And then I complained to my husband about the fact I had so much life admin to get through. And I was like, but I just can't. At the end of the day, I just can't. I just need to read. And that is a good use of my time for 2 hours straight with my daughter asleep.
What I love about you is that you're very clear about that. I mean, doesn't that sound great? You know, I wish I could do that. We are the sum of all the moments of our lives, writes Thomas Wolfe. All that is ours is in them. We cannot escape it or conceal it. If we're going to show up for, and thus find some enjoyment in, our brief time on this planet, we had better show up for it now. I'm like, yes, Oliver, I want to show up for it, but I'm just not sure I'm doing it right. Anyway, tell me about this French book then.
Yeah, well, it's a good transition because No Touching, as I mentioned in the intro, is about a woman in her mid-30s who is a very beleaguered philosophy teacher in the public school system in an underprivileged suburb of Paris. And she's teaching to the students who aren't very engaged, but that's not the worst of it. It's more that the school board standards keep dropping and dropping in terms of what they expect of the students. And so there's no support for them. And the principal's always trying to push off any complaints from the teachers around, say, physical abuse. It's just a horrible situation. And she commutes an hour and a half every day. And she's sort of dead on her feet when we meet her at the very beginning of the book. Let me read you that first page. Today I don't exist. Tomorrow I probably won't either. This weekend I'll knock back a few Diabolo mint citron sodas on my own. I'll lick my fingers, all of them, after scarfing down some peanuts. I look down. The gravelled concrete slabs wink at me. They sparkle like the sand crystals in playground asphalt. I line my feet up on the crack between two slabs and then jump with both feet. My own personal game of hopscotch. At this rate, I'll miss the bus. I really couldn't care less. Today is the first day of school. So there's that thread to the novel, but then she begins to find fulfillment when she stumbles into a strip club. And then over the course of, 6 to 9 months, she takes a pole dancing class. And this is kind of we're looking back at this a little bit in the present. Kate's face is hilarious.
Well, I'm just thinking, it's just that sentence. She begins to find fulfillment when she stumbles into a strip club. I mean, is it because it's French? I mean, that just seems very unlikely to me.
Kate,
as
it's
a
very
premise.
French. I keep talking to people about this book, and I'm like, I think it's good, but it's very French. I mean, philosophy, strip clubs, the art of the striptease. There's so much in this book where I was just like, this feels very problematic. But also, there is a lot that's going on over my head because she is a philosophy teacher and the author herself is a former philosophy teacher. I mean, you couldn't get more French than that, right? And there's essentially these passages that are never too labored, but are around the nature of freedom. I mean, the book is called No Touching. And when she becomes a dancer in these nightclubs, suddenly she's cut off from this horrible beige bureaucratic world she's trapped in with schools. And she's in this dark world of desire and fantasy. And you don't know where it's going to go. And you're concerned for her. You're concerned that it could get very dark. And actually, it's much more interesting than that. I think it's really good, but I'm not entirely sure. And I'm desperate for other people to read it. I went to Goodreads, which I never do because I'm always like, I don't care what other people think. I want to form my own opinions. But this was such an intriguing book and the language is really vivid and powerful. So I wanted to know what other people thought, kind of to check my own assumptions. Most people give it 4 stars. There's like one dude giving it 2. There's one reviewer in here, a Roman Claudia.
Oh my God. I love, it's just so funny because I have a quote from him on another book that I was going to pull out.
Do you?
He's really good. Anyway.
Well, I mean, he or she is obviously on the same reading track as us. And he or she has pulled a quote from the book, another one. I feel like this book just demands that because describing it just sounds quite strange. You need the actual language to kind of show that maybe it does hold up. The quote is, "When the woman dances, it's always herself she's dancing with. That pleasure can't be shared, it's hers alone, untransmittable. But he thinks out there in the audience that she's dancing for him." And then Roman Claudia says, "This is undoubtedly provocative and deliberately so, as the book takes as its source Descartes' mind-body division and plays it out via the life of a contemporary French woman who teaches philosophy in a school by day and slips into being a pole lap dancer by night." I'm like, oh, is that what it's about?
That's
it's
why
about Descartes' mind-body division?
They're very good at articulating things.
I wanted to reread this book because I think the first time you read it for plot and for the sensationalism of it. There's a lot of smutty passages in here. But you get to the end and you think, oh, wait a second, what did I just read? And the narrator is really endearing. You feel like you are with her at every moment in her life as she lives through these two contrasting spaces. This horrible school atmosphere and then this literally titillating strip club atmosphere. I think you should definitely read it. Our mutual friend Francis is reading it right now, and I was like, great. Please report back. It would be such a good book club discussion, assuming that your book club can handle the passages. I mean, let's be honest. We know that Kate has some issues sometimes with too much smut.
Well, it depends on the writing. If the writing's good enough, I don't have issues.
Well, and interesting, there's also there's no sex.
Okay.
Because it's about desire, isn't it? And the book's called No Touching. So, that's interesting, isn't it? It's translated, I should say, and I think it's translated very well by Tina Cover. And you'd like this. Someone else on Goodreads compared her writing to Otessa Moshfegh, who you love.
Who I love. And you just saw that in the library and picked it up because you like the cover, or?
Oh, yeah. Look at that cover.
Yeah, it is a great cover. It's a sort of sequins, isn't it?
It's blue sequins with the bold title No Touching popping out, kind of peeping out.
It's one of those beautiful Europa editions. We've talked about those before, the way that they just sort of, there's something a little bit, they just make you feel a bit more cultural, just holding them.
Highly recommended, I think. I mean, I'm not saying you're going to like it, folks. You might not, but I want to hear why. I want to understand more. There's lots in it that feels problematic, but I'd like to dig deeper.
All right, let's move to a book that I think many people will be more than familiar with. It's been a big success. It recently won the Rathbones Folio Prize, which is a prize that I love because I usually always like the books that win that prize so much. And it is The Magician by... Now, I've always been a little bit unsure about how to pronounce this author's name. And then, as is often the case in the 3 minutes and a half that I was prepping before we actually sat down to record, I always look and see how people pronounce it. And anyway, usually a few quick YouTube videos and you get something vaguely definitive. And with this one, even the videos that I was watching, everyone seems to be pronouncing it differently. And then I rang my Irish friend Emily, an emergency call. Emily, how do you pronounce the Irish author of The Magician and Brooklyn? And she said it's Tóibín. It's Colm Tóibín. So, The Magician by Colm Tóibín. Now I know, now listeners, now you know, assuming Emily's right, but she's Irish. She would know, right? So this is his fictional telling of the life of Thomas Mann, author of Magic Mountain, Buddenbrooks, Nobel Prize winning author, whose life spanned most of the 20th century. He lived through the First World War, Second World War. He had to flee Germany and then went to Switzerland with his family. Although his wife's family weren't practicing Jews, his wife's parents were Jewish, so there was a Jewish connection through marriage. And he himself had, 6 children? Seemed to be a lot of them. I think it was 6. Anyway, so big family, and they went to Switzerland. They realised they couldn't go back, so they stayed in Switzerland. And then they ended up in America. They lived in Princeton for some time. Meanwhile, the children are now adults and they're all off doing different things in different places. And then they went to LA and lived there in California for a while. And then eventually he came back to Switzerland. The Magician tells the story of Thomas Mann, whose life was filled with great acclaim and contradiction. He would find himself on the wrong side of history in the First World War, cheerleading the German army, but have a clear vision of the future in the Second, anticipating the horrors of Nazism. He would have 6 children and keep his homosexuality hidden. He was a man forever connected to his family and yet bore witness to the ravages of suicide. He would write some of the greatest works of European literature and win the Nobel Prize, but would never return to the country that inspired his creativity. Oh, I don't like that blurb. I think that's really unhelpful. But, perhaps in there is something of my own struggles with the book, because it's quite a hard book to sum up. And there's something almost about the slightly episodic, this happened, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this, of that blurb. That is absolutely the way that this book is written. And I think one of the problems I had with it is it just felt like little bit of information after little bit of information after little bit of information. And the way it's written, I was just so disappointed, because I think it didn't help that I had so recently read The Magic Mountain, and for me that book was a real journey. I kind of lived it. I was very absorbed in it. Maybe fell in love with Thomas Mann a little bit in that way that you do when you read a book by an author you like and admire, and you do feel, I think, like you have a sense that you know maybe what they're like, or you somehow know something about them. And so then I was really excited to read this book about Mann, because I just sort of thought I would get to know him better. And I was just so disconcerted by Colm Tóibín's rendering of him, I think because it just never came to life for me. And not just Mann, Mann himself, things happen all around him all the time. And he's almost like the kind of still centre of the book. And so it's strange, almost a slight contradiction, because there's one sense that Tóibín wants to look at his writing and his work and look at his life and look at his family and explore how one informed the other. But then you don't really get any sense of that, because you never really get any sense of the interior life of Mann, or at least I didn't. And neither, I might add, did our friend Roman Clodia, who puts it plainly. It is clear from the afterword that Tóibín has read a lot about Mann, but somehow there's no sense of personality, of intellect, or of feeling that inhabits the space demarked as Thomas Mann in the novel. An avatar goes through the motions of Mann's life almost like a series of tick boxes, but none of it feels lived. Meanwhile, another review made me smile, V. Halliday, who wrote, I've never read a Thomas Mann novel, worrying that I'd find his work too serious, stodgy and old white blokish, so I'm not sure why I decided to read a lightly fictionalised biography of him instead. Unfortunately, but perhaps unsurprisingly, I found The Magician to be too serious, stodgy and old white blokish for me. Mann spends the novel being distant, leering over very young men and failing to take much of a stand against the Nazis. He seems much more preoccupied with his social position and reputation than doing the right thing, and I didn't warm to him at all. There are these different themes that run through it that come in and out. So there's this idea of his feelings towards Germany, his homeland, exile, looking back on it, this very complicated relationship with a place that changed so radically, and his own feelings of uncertainty about where to position himself. The people cared about what he thought. So I think one of the themes of this is his wrestling with what to say and when and how to use his position. But ultimately, it makes him a frustrating figure because he never really takes much of a stand. And you're always like, come on, Thomas, just, And he always draws back. And there's this recurring thing about whenever anything slightly difficult happens, he just retreats into his study and goes off to work. I don't know, it's just this sort of little...
And you don't go with him.
Not really.
You don't know what's happening.
Or you would, but it's just all quite boring. You just feel like you just want to leave the room and go and talk to some other people. The thing about the little I have read about him is that his family sounded fascinating. So one of the people who I think should really spring off the page and doesn't is his daughter Erica Mann. And she was amazing. She did all kinds of interesting things. She won some epic cross-country car race that she drove in, and she was a writer herself, and she wrote plays, and she performed, and she was an activist, and she came to London, and she worked for the BBC reporting on the war, and was very active as a journalist, I suppose, and had very strong views, was very outspoken, really dynamic, charismatic, interesting person, but you would not know that from reading The Magician. You wouldn't get any of that. So I find that frustrating. I think primarily I felt like I wasn't really getting to know Thomas Mann. But then when I looked at it more clearly, I was like, I'm not really getting to know any of the characters. Everything is conveyed in this very distant, detached way, and it never really comes to life. And I found myself the whole time thinking, why is he writing it like this? I don't understand.
Have you read Brooklyn?
So this is the thing. I haven't ever read anything else by him. So I knew it wasn't The Magic Mountain because I'd read that one, and this isn't like that. And then in the Little Free Library, actually, in the way that life does sometimes, the universe put into my hands a copy of Buddenbrooks, which happened to be in there. I was like, this is a sign. I meant to read this. Anyway, I took it home, read the first chapter, and I was a bit like, oh, I see. I think this is what Tóibín's referencing. It's a family story. It's set in Lübeck. It's telling the story of this decline and of this prosperous family, and as the times change, they don't really adapt. And there's this sense I got. And it felt very much like, oh, I see. I think that's what he's referencing. That makes sense. So maybe if I read Buddenbrooks, I would understand more and I would see more. But I don't think you should need to have read another book in order to appreciate this book. That in itself feels like a flaw to me. And so many people have loved this book. People whose opinions I really trust, who when they love something, I normally love it too. So, Phil loved this book. He said, I can see what Tóibín was trying to do. I could see how it might not be for everyone. But I just felt like the themes he was exploring, sexuality, public versus private personas, living through epochal Is that right? Is that a word? Epochal? Is that right? Living through
I think so.
epochal and deeply upsetting changes, fascism, communal guilt, etc. Felt so stunningly fresh and relevant, and the characters so real. Phil found the characters real.
Well, now I might have to read it
missing?
just because I'm intrigued. I want to be an arbiter.
And the characters
See which side I come
and the
down on.
scenes. So it's true. There's a certain almost cinematic quality to the way he sets up scenes and he sets up characters. So there's this slightly crazy thing where Erica Mann, in order to escape the Nazis, she had this kind of fake marriage to W.H. Auden. They were married. She just wrote to him and said, "Will you marry me? I need a British passport." He said, apparently very charmingly, nicely, he said, "Delighted. I would be delighted." First of all, she asked Christopher Isherwood and he refused. And then she tried Auden and he said yes. And so that's very random. I didn't know any of that. But so then there are these strange set pieces where they're all having tea together at Thomas Mann's house. But I feel like I'm making it sound more interesting and lively than for me it did, although Phil obviously got something from it. The one thing I would say is I got to the end and I was almost primed for this to happen, because certainly it's what happens with the Magic Mountain. You know, you read a very, very, very long book and it's really only in the last chapter that, certainly for me, I felt completely overwhelmed by what he was doing. I just thought, oh my God, this is so extraordinary, because it is in the Magic Mountain. In the last 3 pages of this 484-page book, he goes back to Mann's childhood and his mother, who's a rather extraordinary figure, Brazilian woman, telling her 4 children a story. It's a story about Bach, the composer, and it's a story about him walking to try and see someone, this other composer, this established composer, who has said that if he can find the right pupil, he will give them the secret to writing the most extraordinary music, the most divine music. And Bach wants to go to be his pupil. And so there's this story that she tells. It's a little bit like a fairy story, the story you tell children. And there was just something about the way that that story was related. And suddenly it was like all of the little tiny fragments of this book, which I realized are like notes, dropped into place for me. And I suddenly saw that it is this kind of extraordinary composition and all of these different little elements, which for me, I felt like I couldn't really understand the tone of it. It felt so monotone in a way, so flat, like it doesn't really vary much. Everything is kind of related in the same way. But I realized it's like in all of these little elements, when you look at the composition as a whole and you suddenly see the composition as a whole and you see the themes almost like musical movements that are running through it. And sometimes one comes to the fore and then it drops back and then another one. So like his homosexuality or his feelings about Germany or his relationships with his children, his family. It's all woven in there. And just at the very end, I suddenly was like, oh, wow, you know, okay, I think I see what he's doing. That's amazing. I was suddenly very impressed by it. And then I relayed this to Phil and he was like, what happened in the last 3 pages? Like he didn't see that at all. Like for him, I think he'd had that sense all the way through. But it was just, for me, it was the sudden, like, switching a light on. Suddenly I was like, But I do feel, though, that even though looking back on it, I'm inclined to admire it a lot more and think he's done something very clever. At the same time, I feel like I can't dismiss my actual experience of reading it, which was that I wasn't really enjoying it very much. I felt bored. I felt frustrated. I just wanted there to be more than I was getting. And I felt a bit puzzled by it, mainly. Puzzled by it. But, you know, I can't deny it's a really interesting book. I am glad I read it. And I think definitely have to read something else by him.
Well, if it lands in my lap, I'll give it a go just to see where I fall between you and the rest of the world, including Phil, because I'm intrigued now. I am intrigued. Well, shall we shift gears to something that's very readable? I flagged this at the beginning, but I read The Mothers over the past 48 hours, and it was glorious. I had some really great long hours of reading, and it's not a super long novel. But if you've read The Vanishing Half, then you know of Brit Bennett. Kate and I have, and very much enjoyed it. It's in our backlist. The Mothers is her first novel, and I think it had a certain amount of acclaim, but certainly not as much as The Vanishing Half. Let me just read the blurb quickly. An urgent and provocative debut from an exciting new voice, The Mothers is a book about community and ambition, love and friendship, and living up to expectation in contemporary Black America. It begins with a secret, then follows that secret through the lives of 3 different characters, from high school into adulthood, tracing its impact far beyond their South California youth. And then it introduces these 3 characters, which I'll just ad-lib myself. So first of all, there's Nadia Turner, who is a very beautiful 17-year-old whose mother has just committed suicide a few months earlier. So she's in a bit of a downward spiral. She finds a sort of salvation, such a cliche, but in the arms of Luke Shepherd, who's 4 years older than her. He's 21 and he's the son of the pastor of the church where they both go. So Nadia and her grief just really latches onto Luke, and they have this very sweet romance over the summer months that no one really knows about. And at the same time, she befriends a young woman at the church called Aubrey, and they become best friends. And then the story follows the lives of these three characters. The blurb speaks about a secret, and I think it's a very savvy marketing decision to say secret, because that secret is actually that Nadia has an abortion when she becomes pregnant at 17 with Luke's baby.
Are you horribly spoiling it for anyone who might want to read it?
No, this happens early. And I think it's important to know. I don't really believe in trigger warnings, but it's a sad thing. I mean, gosh, if anyone said to me, this book is about abortion, you should read it, I'd be like, what? You're crazy. So maybe listeners are now like, I'm backing away from this. But Brit Bennett is an amazing writer, and I think she teases out what this decision means and why it was made. Nadia's own mother, who's only just committed suicide, had her at 17. And so there is this sense that the child of a child is making a different decision than her mother. You know, her mother ultimately took her own life 17 years on. It sounds bleak, but if you know Brit Bennett, you know that she's such a good storyteller. And she just brings to life characters in all their complexity, and you just feel for them. You feel like you know them. And Aubrey, this friend, comes into her own as the story develops, and she has tragedy in her life too. The book is called The Mothers, potentially because Nadia and Aubrey both have mothers who have failed them in some way. The whole thread around abortion is, what does it mean, perhaps, to your own understanding as you go forward in your life? But then, crucially, these three characters are surrounded by this community, this church community. And so you have the voices of the older women in the churches commenting like a Greek chorus, and they call themselves the mothers, whether or not they even were mother. You know, they're in their 80s and they're commenting on the sort of rumor mill that's swirling around these three characters over a decade or so. It's not a perfect novel. There's a lot going on in it that doesn't quite fit, I think, but it was her first novel. So, you know, you understand that, and then you see what she's gone on to achieve with The Vanishing Half. I think I would recommend this book, despite the subject matter.
Well, it sounds like it had you very happily absorbed. It's always so great, isn't it, when a book comes along that you really don't want to put down?
Yeah, that you can just read for a good 2 hours straight and really sink into it. So that's that one.
Well, that leads on neatly in some ways, although the subject matter is quite different in others, to Sheila Heti's book, Motherhood. Are you familiar with Sheila Heti? She's Canadian. She's from Toronto.
Nope, but I'm only just back, you know.
Sorry, Sheila.
I'm not in the loop, Sheila.
Well, clearly.
No.
Not as fated in your native country as you ought to be.
I am no representative as yet, yeah.
Laura's lived in London too long, that's her problem.
I'm just settling in. It's only been a year.
This was one of the books that was recommended on our podcast we did on motherhood quite recently with Claire Lynch, whose book Small we talked about. We picked out various books that we all felt spoke to us in some way about the theme of motherhood, and this is the one that Claire chose, and it's Sheila Heti's story of a 3-year period in her life where she was really wrestling with and struggling to come to terms with the decision of whether or not to have a child. So as Claire points out, it's slightly problematic if you were someone, and certainly there are plenty of people for whom this is the case, who for whatever reason is not able to get pregnant, is not able to bear a child. I think you would find this quite hard to read because Sheila Heti is not in that position. Hers is very much one of choice. She's with a partner, they're in a loving relationship, they're at that point of, you know, they could if they wanted to. Her partner, Miles, already has a child he had quite young with his first girlfriend or his wife. There's no pressure coming from him. It's the interesting thing about that. He's very much, if you'd like to, we could, but you have to be sure. So the decision rests squarely with her. And then it's so funny. I just enjoyed this book so much more than I thought I was going to.
It sounds a little bit self-indulgent.
That's the thing.
Amusing.
Yeah. So motherhood treats one of the most consequential decisions of early adulthood, whether or not to have children, with the intelligence, wit and originality that have won Sheila Heti international acclaim. Having reached an age where most of her peers are asking themselves whether they will become mothers, Hetty's narrator considers with the same urgency whether she will do so at all. Over the course of several years, under the influence of her partner, body, family, friends, mysticism and chance, she struggles to make a moral and meaningful choice. In a compellingly direct mode that straddles the forms of the novel and the essay, Motherhood raises radical and essential questions about womanhood, parenthood, and how and for whom to live. I think that's the thing. I think it does feel like it might be a bit self-indulgent. There's also a strong thread of art in this, in that she's someone who I think engages with the idea of art, although I haven't read anything else about her, so I can't tell. Now I'm really keen to. I'd love to read some more by her. Funnily enough, actually, I've got one book so I have read her writing before. I've got this really wonderful book called something like Women in Clothes or something. And it's this...
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, this really hard to categorise sort of collaboration between her and Leanne Shapton and another author, and they're pulling together all of these little micro essays about clothes and their relationships with them, and I just love things that are written in that way, so it was catnip to me when it first came out. But I hadn't read anything else by her, and so I think what I was really impressed by with this is her intelligence and her thoughtful approach to the way that she's thinking about this. And it could seem incredibly sort of navel-gazing and self-indulgent and middle-class problems, you know. She doesn't really have any other things to worry about in life, so, you know, she's really spending all her time worrying about this. But it just doesn't. It never does. It never tips over into that. She manages to keep it philosophical and relevant. It felt incredibly relevant because what she's interrogating is the idea of what are women for, and it's full of all these little moments where it just really made me look at things in a different way, or I loved being offered this insight into someone's sharp, clear thinking about things that for me always just seems such a muddle. Another thing that is interesting and probably goes back to No Touching is that it's very explicit in lots of ways. She writes about herself in a way that feels very exposing, and she writes about sex brilliantly, I thought, actually, but in quite some detail. And one of the things that made me smile is at the very end of this book, she sends the manuscript to her mother. And although I recognised the significance of the gesture and could totally see and was absolutely on board with why that was important for her, at the same time I was like, oh, wow, you sent those chapters to your mother? I was kind of impressed. But yeah, so she talks about an early abortion that she had. She did get pregnant once when she was much younger, and there was no question in her mind. She wasn't ready to have a child at that moment, and so it was a very, very early days. She went to the doctor, she asked for an abortion, and the doctor tried quite hard to talk her out of it. She writes, "He showed me the sonogram, even though I didn't want to see it. He told me it was too early to get an abortion, because it was possible I could miscarry. He said it would be wrong to do it now. He joked that I should have the baby and give it to him. He said I could come over to his house with bags of milk every week. It wasn't until I left his office that I realised what he meant, milk that would come from my breasts." And then she's reflecting back on that. Why are we still having children? Why was it important for that doctor that I did? A woman must have children because she must be occupied. When I think of all the people who want to forbid abortions, it seems it can only mean one thing. Not that they want this new person in the world, but that they want that woman to be doing the work of child-rearing more than they want her to be doing anything else. There is something threatening about a woman who is not occupied with children. There is something at loose ends feeling about such a woman. What is she going to do instead? What sort of trouble will she make? And so it's got this...
Kate, that's so interesting.
Isn't it?
That's so interesting in relation to the mothers, because this 17-year-old character has an abortion, and that means she can go to university and she can have these options available. And I think, yeah, I got goosebumps a little bit. And to be clear, I think Brit Bennett shows that there is the potential for ongoing grieving over that decision too. And maybe Hetty's showing something different, that for her it wasn't a source of grief.
In some ways, that is the grief of the children that she's in the process of choosing not to have. And what will she decide? She writes, have you ever considered, Laura, that we women are basically just passageways for a man to come out? Have you ever thought of it that way? She says...
Especially as we're both mothers of daughters.
Putting the book down, I realised that throughout most of history, it was enough for men that women existed to give birth to men and raise them. And if a woman gave birth to a girl, well then, with luck, the girl would grow up to give birth to a man. It seemed to me like all my worrying about not being a mother came down to this history, this implication that a woman is not an end in herself. She is a means to a man, who will grow up to be an end in himself and do something in the world, while a woman is a passageway through which a man might come. I have always felt like an end in myself, doesn't everyone? But perhaps my doubt that being an end in myself is enough comes from this deep lineage of women not being seen as ends. but as passageways through which a man might come. If you refuse to be a passageway, there is something wrong. You must at least try. But I don't want to be a passageway through which a man might come, then manifest himself in the world however he likes without anyone doubting his right. I mean, don't you just love that? It's full of these things. That's so good. So I love this. It's got her own reflections about the things she's reading, the things she's thinking about, the things she's working on. There are also all of these little snippets about her real life. I suppose that helps you feel very connected to her and invested in her, even though I sort of feel that this is someone who in real life would never talk to me. She's way too smart and cool and interesting. You know what I mean?
It with Rachel Cuss.
But I'm reading this book and I can experience what it's like to know her inner thoughts. Do you know what I mean? It had that almost slightly intimate quality to it that I really loved. So it was a real surprise. Like you, actually, I came across it at the library and just picked it up and thought, oh, that's the one that Claire recommended. Maybe I'll have a little look. And so added it to my stack. And then when I got home, idly opened it and started reading. And immediately I was like, oh, this is really interesting. So I recommend it.
Well, I'm quite proud of our reading list, this bookshelf. I think we've given listeners a lot to consider and decide if it's right for them. Watch this space, guys, on an upcoming episode. Hopefully I'll tell you about Savage Tongues, maybe Little. If you're really lucky, I might get through Secrets of the Sprakar by the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid. That's on my TBR list. So there's more in the works.
I've got to get cracking on that Leila Slimani book, haven't I? The Country of Others, because we're doing that for your book club.
Yeah,
on the podcast.
I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah, great. Can't wait. That's nearly it for this episode. Books discussed were 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, No Touching by Ketty Rouf, The Magician by Colm Tóibín, Motherhood by Sheila Heti, and The Mothers by Brit Bennett. Laura also mentioned Savage Tongues by Azarine van der Vliet Alumi, Little by Edward Carey, and Secrets of the Sprakar by Eliza Reid. So if you like, you can read along with her and compare notes on our next bookshelf episode. Coming soon, we'll be discussing Leila Slimani's recent book, The Country of Others, which Salman Rushdie described as beautifully created. Life springs vividly from the page, an exceptional novel. But did Laura's book club agree? Let's find out. For book recommendations, don't miss our 2 recent episodes, Motherhood with Claire Lynch and Elizabeth Morris, in which we discuss Claire's book Small and pick out other favourite reads on the theme, and our interview with Francesca Bowman about her book The Literary Almanac, which aims to give readers seasonal recommendations to help them find the perfect read at the perfect time. You can find those shows and others at our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you can browse through over 100 other episodes in our back catalogue. Give them a try. I like to think they're like books on a shelf, just waiting patiently for someone to come along and pick them up. Get in touch with us and tell us what you're reading or recommend us a book on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, do subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. If you want to support us, please do rate and review the show and tell all your friends. Tell your friends' parents. Get them to tell their friends. We love to reach new listeners, but we're always trying to crack the conundrum of how. Maybe you can help. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.